Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Dr. Sharon Blackie, and Sharon is an award-winning author and psychologist with a background in mythology and folklore. Her highly acclaimed books, lectures, and teaching programs are focused on reimagining women's stories and on the relevance of myth, fairy tales, and folk traditions to the personal, cultural, and environmental problems we face today. Sharon has written 5 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the best-selling If Women Rose Rooted. Her books have been translated into several languages, and she has been interviewed by the BBC, US Public Radio, and other broadcasters in the areas of her expertise. Sharon is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and has taught and lectured at several academic institutions, including Pacifica Graduate Institute in California in the US. And I've previously spoken to quite a few people from Pacifica Graduate. But welcome, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Don. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking with you.
Sharon, when I woke up this morning, I was thinking I've been reading The Enchanted Life, and I was thinking that James Hillman said something that I liked, that beauty feeds the soul. And as I was, reading through again The Enchanted Life, I was thinking, putting it in your language, you could say enchantment feeds the soul. And, one of the points that you make is that so many people, perhaps within a variety of fields, have said that they've noted the disenchantment, the alienation, the breakdown of modernism since the rational enlightenment, and we went in a certain direction or whatever. And it seems we often go into the disenchantment, but what about the enchantment? What about the opening up? What about the re-enchantment? And then that's very much what you're talking about. But anyway, hopefully we can get on to that very shortly.
Sure, we can.
But firstly, I usually like to ask people a little bit about their turning points and their main influences. And I wondered whether you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the northeast of England in a very impoverished environment, and as a child, led a very enchanted inner life anyway, full of fairy tales and imaginings. Even even in the circumstances that I was. And then got very disenchanted, mostly by doing a psychology degree. Curiously enough, I did a psychology degree in a very behaviorist department in the UK, where we were hardly allowed to say the word mind, because if you couldn't see it, it wasn't real. I mean, it was really very extreme, and it took me a long time to overcome that. I had joined a big multinational corporation, basically for safety. I had led a very unsafe early life, and I wanted safety and security, but I knew I had this sense of some kind of calling. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that that was not what I was supposed to be. So I kept trying to leave and failing to leave, and eventually I got to my mid-30s, and I figured out that this whole desperate searching for safety was, effectively stopping me from fully living. And so I decided, bizarrely, to learn to fly, to overcome a fear of flying. And that was, I was in the middle of America. It was kind of easy to do. It was very much cheaper over there. And it was kind of radical because nobody from my background ever did anything like that. And I really did feel when I was doing that as if I really had to look death in the face, in order to fully be able to live. It sounds a little bit cliched, but it wasn't very cliched at all when I got in that little plane. And every time I pushed the throttle in, I was convinced I was going to die. So that really changed everything for me. That sense that, okay, I can do this. I can do anything. If I can do this, I can do anything. So I stopped corporate life, read a lot of psychology, retrained as a psychologist, but in a kind of slightly more Jungian way. We never even heard the word Jung when I was doing my psychology degree.
Same as me.
Freud, but not Jung. So that was really very, very, very
It,
important
it,
to me.
it was rats and stats when I did at the
Yeah,
University of Western Australia. And
absolutely.
you had to be very good at statistics, which was a
Yeah,
little bit like Swahili to me, I must say, but not quite why I joined up.
No, well, I went on to do a PhD in neuroscience after my psychology degree, so the statistics came in very useful. But I couldn't ever say that I loved it or anything very much else that I learned. So that whole midlife thing, which was kind of like I think that was the third in a series of midlife crises. I really went for it in my 30s. Really made me think about, okay, who am I? What is my calling? I read James Hillman, I read The Soul's Code, and I thought, okay, something has to shift here in my life. So Hillman was, I know he was very important for you as well. And I've
Mm.
heard your story of him falling off a bookshelf. I came across him in a slightly more normal, if I can say that way. But he really, that whole sense of purpose set me off on a completely different track, going back to Plato, going back to the old kind of ancient European concepts of the soul and what we're here for, and so on. So that was really, I suppose, the first big turning point in my new life.
They were kind of like psychologists before there was psychology, wasn't it? They were psychologists of the soul, the Neoplatonists, and
Absolutely.
you know, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff that Plato wrote about the soul and the soul's journey before it comes into this life really is that's quite unknown for Plato. Plato people read all of the political stuff and all of the kind of civic stuff on Plato, but it's almost as if that part of it has just been pushed aside because it's all too complex. It's cosmological, and we can't be doing that in proper intellectual life these days.
So, and then what happened then after that kind of opening up, if we can call it that?
Yeah, well, I was living in America at the time. I finally left corporate life. I came back to Scotland, which is where my father was from. I moved right to the northwest, far northwest of Scotland. I bought a croft with a
Yeah.
dilapidated old house that I did up. And I developed over the years a very strong and intense relationship with place. And particularly after a few years, I moved with my new husband to the Isle of Lewis and the Outer Hebrides. And I don't really know where it came from, that connection with place, because I don't think I'd really had it ever since I was a child.
Right.
But we lived in a very, very remote place. We looked out west to St Kilda and then across to North America. And there was nobody very much there. And so I didn't have anybody to talk to with my husband, which is very fine, but sometimes you need more. So I would spend a lot of time out in the lands with out in the land with the dogs. We lived, by the coast, mountains at the back of us, very beautiful. And it was just, I had nobody else to talk to, so I talked to the land. And I
Mm.
talked to rocks, and there was a particular folkloric character in that part of the world who's also very prominent in Ireland, who was very real there, in place names and shapes in the landscape. And she was called the Cailleach, which in Gaelic and Gaelic actually means old woman, just simply means old woman. And in that mythology, she was the old woman who created and shaped the land. She was incredibly important. She was a guardian and protector of the land. She was the thing. And I developed a very strong relationship with that kind of archetypal old woman. I would talk to her in my head. I would see a shape of her in a rock. And so it all became very real. And I think that experience of feeling that I really had, or I called it falling into the lands dreaming, because that's what I thought I was doing. There was no separation most mornings when I worked out on the headland. And so again, that turned my the trajectory of my work towards a very place-centered sense of belonging to the land, and how I had been deeply enchanted by 4 years on that island. It was remarkable. It was synchronistic. It was mythic. It was, and for my husband as well, albeit in different ways. And so, yeah, that was real to me. So when I
Yeah.
wrote The Enchanted Life, I wasn't talking theory. I was talking about, no, I've been there. And if I can be there, after my very scientific psychology degree, after all those years in corporate life, then boy, anybody can do it. And that's what I started then to do, to try to teach anybody to do it.
It's kind of like you've got the theory, like the theory behind you, but what comes through is the embodiment and the spirit of place. And that's also what I was thinking with Hillman, with the anima mundi and the soul of the world. But he always returns to Greece, doesn't he? The Greek myths and that, where you're coming from that more the spirit of place, but the Celtic kind of tradition too, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I had Greek and Roman mythology rammed down my throat as a child, at school and in my readings. It's very wonderful. Don't get me wrong. But
Yeah.
boy, there's more. And I think one of the things that kind of perplexed me about the contemporary depth psychology field when I started to to work with it is the extent to which people are so hung up on Greek mythology. I mean, it's easy because they are archetypal almost by design. You know, you can say the god of or the goddess of. You
Yeah.
can't do that in Celtic mythology. There's no such thing. There is no pantheon. But what you have is a kind of subtler representation of the archetypes. You know, the Cailleach is not the goddess of anything. She created and shaped the land. She stands for the natural world, but she's kind of, you know, she's too complex a character to be essentialized in that way. And also, you know, Aphrodite doesn't work in the Outer Hebrides. You know, she's all beautiful, dry, sunny weather and olive groves. We have bogs and rain and constant wind. And it's just like, no, that doesn't work for me here. That wasn't the spirit of my land. And I was on that land and I wanted to know the characters that came from that land. And that's what I wrote If Women Rose Rooted about all of the women in Celtic mythology, particularly Irish mythology, who were not only immanent in the land, so literally creatures of this landscape and protectors of the people and the other beings who lived on it, but they were also the moral voice of the other world in our mythology. So in the Greek mythology is terribly patriarchal, you know, incredibly patriarchal, where certainly the later Olympian mythology, not the earlier stuff so much, but our mythology is not. In Irish and other Celtic mythology, women are the voices of the other world. They're the ones who bring the life-giving, kind of nourishing waters of the other world into this one. They're the ones who determine who is fit to be the best king, you know. So I found that absolutely revolutionary. And these voices were in my land, not someone else's across the sea, but
Yeah.
my land. And that became very, very important to me.
So in my language, you kind of woke up to a spirit of place and your, what's the word, ancestry and the ancestors of your place at that time on the Isle of Lewis. That's what was happening to you.
Yeah, I think that ancestral lineage is very important. Okay, there are two parts to this for me. One
Yeah.
is the attachment and the connection relationship to the place where your feet are planted now. I think that's essential. We have a responsibility to it. You know, it gives us life. But I think that the ancestral mythology, the ancestral archetypes that have been passed down through our lineage kind of show us how to do that. So, for example, this Cailleach character that I'm talking about in the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, I then moved to a part of Ireland, which was probably the only part of Ireland where there was no Cailleach mythology. And I was absolutely bereft. Absolutely. I didn't have the old woman in my place. And I'd grown used to an old woman kind of, you know, occupying my imaginal world being very important to me. And one day, we lived by a heronry, by a little river. One day, walking along a river, we startled, and with the dogs very early in the morning, we startled a heron, and the heron flew off, grey heron, in this part of the world, shrieking for all the world like an old hag. And then, I had it. In our mythology, herons were often shape-shifting into older women. They guarded the gates to the other world. I had found the old woman archetype in my place. Do you know? And I
The
hadn't
heron.
done it through an existing story. I'd done it through my relationship, through my imagining. So somewhere between my imagining and my relationship with the land had come this whole new character, half woman, half heron, who I called Old Crane Woman. Because I knew about the Cailleach. You can do that in Australia. You can do it in America. You can find the old woman archetype in your land by understanding the archetypes in your past, if that makes sense. We always think that that we can only connect with old stories, you know? But where did the old stories come from? They came from people's relationship with their land. And we can still do that. And I think people have this sense, I find it all the time, that the old stories were written down, so they must be real. You know, it's kind of like the Bible. That's it. It can't move on anymore. It's fixed. We kind of have that with our own stories because they've been written down. And what I'm constantly trying to do is break through that and say, no, we know we're still myth-making beings. We're still myth makers.
Mm.
Let's make it again, make it new, make it contemporary, if you like.
Mm. And just on another, just going across to another side for a second, what about the whole writing thing, Sharon? How did this emerge in you? I mean, you know, when you were saying you were in the corporate world and all of that, were you doing any writing then, or was that something that emerged later?
Um, when I was a little girl, I always thought writers were other people. They were posh girls. You know, they weren't like me.
Right.
They didn't grow up in a housing estate in one of the most top 10 deprived housing estates in the country. It wasn't for me, but I always wanted to write, always wanted to write. I had a go at a couple of things when I was in corporate life, but my heart wasn't in it. I didn't have a story to tell. And the truth is, I didn't have anything to say until I had got out of that plane for the last time in New Mexico with my pilot's license.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, I had a story to tell. So I could write really well. I'm not being kind of, immodest here. It's just a fact. I was a really good writer, but I had no story. I had
Yeah.
nothing that had heart in it.
The
So I wrote
the
my
the
first novel.
passion needed to open up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that didn't happen to me until until I was about 40. And then I wrote my first novel, which had a lot of mythic elements in it as well, which is kind of a fictionalized version of that and of my own childhood. And then once I'd written a novel, it's just like, okay, what kind of then the ideas come. It's almost like you've broken the dam, So it's then you have, and I was older and I had something to say. Some people have something to say at 20, and that's great. I
Yeah.
just didn't.
Yeah.
And now I can't shut up, just a head full of stuff that wants to get out.
Yeah. But it's, that's beautiful. So, yeah. What I was going to say is you started writing, you're opening up to all these experiences. So how did you get, when you wrote the Enchanted Life, um, how did that start? What was that all about?
Well, I had written If Women Rose Rooted, and that was kind of a strange thing. I had been editing a magazine, let's say. I had founded and edited a magazine for nature writing, where I kept trying to bring in the mythic, and an agent contacted me out of the blue one day and said, "Have you ever thought of writing a book about this?" And of course, I hadn't, because I thought of myself as a fiction writer. And then I did. So, anyway, to cut a long story short, that eventually became If Women Rose Rooted, and it was very much a kind of manifesto for women, particularly whose voices, of course, have been, stripped away from us over the centuries, to reconnect with the land again. And more than that, to take responsibility for it, to just kind of step up in a world that is breaking. And a lot of and I was talking a lot about my own relationship, like the relationship that I was talking about in Lewis. And a lot of people were saying, okay, but that's lovely, but how do I do that? What does it mean for me? I can see that you've lived in the Outer Hebrides, and what does it mean for me? And If Women Rose Rooted wasn't a how-to book, it was kind of a manifesto. So I
Yeah.
wrote The Enchanted Life to try to pick that to pieces. What was it, particularly in my own experience? Because I think unless you're writing an academic book, you've got to write it from your own experience. What was it that it looked like? And I just picked apart, the experience of wonder, the necessity of place, the importance of stories and the mythic imagination, the importance of embodied relationship with the land, as you mentioned earlier, because I think the imagination in the West has become so that it's just a part of our inner life. It's in our heads, where it should also be in our bodies. And when we touch a tree, we're in relationship with it. That's a two-way thing. In a sense, the tree is always also touching us. So that sense of needing it to be embodied as well. So I put all of this together in The Enchanted Life. It's kind of no, it's not really a how-to book, is it? But it did have some prompts
Yeah.
and some ideas
It's
for
not,
growing
I
this.
wouldn't call it a how to. I'd say it's got both. It's got the ideas behind, and then it's also got some prompts for, well, I mean, I think you're giving a message too that, you know, perhaps enchantment seems, it's a little bit like art for many people. It seems for the chosen few. And perhaps people think enchantment is a way off kind of idea in this time of, upside downness or whatever. But you're kind of saying that, well, there are ways we can aid this enchantment. Um,
Yeah.
slowing down is one way. That's one way you mentioned.
Definitely. You can't have a relationship with anything very much unless you slow down and pay attention to it. So, the risk of stating the obvious. So a lot of it was about that. But I think what I was trying to be very careful to do was kind of define what I meant by enchantment, because when I first started talking about enchantment, a well-known storyteller over here started saying, well, stories aren't about enchantment, they're about waking up. And it's just like, yes, that's what I'm saying, though. Enchantment isn't magical thinking. It's
Yeah,
not superstition. It's not about, loving pretty little fairies with, sequined wings. It's about waking up to what is out in the world and how we blend into the world and are not separate from it in all of these amazing ways. And it really is just a lot of it is about a change of perspective,
Mm.
about the way that you look at the world and your relationship with it. It's not about changing your life, although it can be, and it has been for a lot of people. And so I was trying to define enchantment as, a very embodied way of belonging
Mm.
to the greater cosmos,
Mm.
beginning with the place where our feet are planted.
So, recently I was talking to Rick Tarnas, and he has a chapter in his book, Cosmos and Psyche, on opening up to the cosmos. Um, uh, but it's like to me, I think of it also like you're talking about what many people would relate to Indigenous peoples, like the Australian Aboriginals, the connection to the land, the embodiment, that side of it as well. So it's opening up to that side of the world, and
Very much
and
so.
and loving and beginning to love the world again.
Yeah, I think, there is a tendency today, and it's perfectly understandable, to just look at the news and say, oh my God, everything's shit, everything is broken, it's all miserable, we just might as well stop. And that's just, that old concept of the anima mundi, which of course, as you said, Hillman wrote a lot about, that whole concept of an ensouled world. It seems to me that we kind of have a responsibility to it. If we engage with it, we keep it alive. It's like any relationship. Any person alone in a flat is going to die of loneliness and lack of connection, lack of relationship. It's the same with the world's soul. It needs to be engaged with, and that gives life to the world as well as to us, I think. And really, one of the things I didn't write about in Enchanted Life, which I've written about a little bit since and will again, is what Rick Tarnas was talking about in Cosmos and Psyche, that sense of being part of the cosmos. One of the things that really connects me beyond the red squirrel in the tree outside of my window, to a wider world is I have this app on my computer, which is called Stellarium app, and it tells you in the direction that you are pointing and looking what constellations are wheeling across your sky at this time. And that to me is remarkable. I can see a lynx out there just crossing from west to east. I can see Sirius, the dog star, rising, and that's real as well. And then that becomes not in my head, but it becomes something that's out there, so I can't quite see, but then I know it's there in a different kind of way. So there are all kinds of ways of connecting imaginally, um, being in relationship.
And maybe to me, there is kind of the transcendental, you know, macro intelligence of the universe and the embodied. Like they're feeding each other somehow for the whole,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, it's classic panentheistic way of looking at the world, isn't it? Where, where you see the divine as immanent, but also a little bit in some ways separate,
Mm.
removed.
Yeah. Micro, macro.
Mhm.
And what about wonder and awe and all these things? I mean, they're in the bag of enchantment, but what are they?
Again, I think it's something we do as a child when we're discovering everything for the first time. And of course, it's very easy to have a sense of wonder when you're discovering something for the first time. But I guess my point in the Enchanted Life is to keep that sense of wonder going, because you can look at a tree when you're a child and think, okay, I know a tree. But you can look at it again when you're 62, as I am, and see different things in trees, different patterns, different ways of being. And it's a deepening of that knowing and of that understanding. And that is also, I think, a thing of wonder. And so again, an attempt to persuade people just to shift their perspective a little bit and don't say, yeah, I've been seeing trees for 62 years. I know what a tree is, but to look at it as if it was something you hadn't seen before and to examine all of the amazing ways that, of being a tree.
And do you think you're a mystic?
Oh,
Are you just
mm,
have you just got a bit of an open channel and uh, a mystic
no,
bent or something?
no, I have never had any great mystical experiences. The only experiences that I have had that I would call mystical are synchronous experiences, big dreams, and I have a very strong relationship with images and cards like tarot. I can pick the same thing, 3 times in a row, which I know the stats on that are just that's a meaningful thing to happen. But I think it's a learned thing, and I really do think that what opened. So I don't know whether this is mysticism or not. It's very embodied mysticism, if it is, or a kind of land-based mysticism. Myth, myth does it for me. I can see stories in everything.
Right.
Fairy tales, myths are really, really important to me, but only if I can bring them back in some way to my kind of embodied life, and that's so important. I mean, if you go back to Plato and the ancient Greeks, the theory is we chose to be embodied. We chose to come here. So if we spend all of our lives in our head trying to get away from our bodies, like a lot of the kind of, um, monotheistic religions around the world do, where's the sense in that? It's about this embodied experience, which includes the imaginal, what we think of inside of our head. So I don't know whether that's mystical or not. If it is, it's maybe a different kind of form of mysticism.
Well, I think what you said embodied mysticism. I mean, you had a mystical experience in my view of things when you saw the heron.
Yeah.
Like, why isn't that mystical? I mean, the deer.
Oh, sure. And all the time on the Isle of Lewis. And I
Mm.
wasn't out looking for it, you know. That would have frightened the life out of me, probably, if I'd actually thought of going looking for something like that. But it happens to you if you're paying attention and if you're really open to it. It's about being open to it. And I think it is a lifelong practice. It's not one day you're going to wake up and all of a sudden you're kind of seeing angels. It's just it's about a practice of paying attention. And I don't mean that in a kind of subject object way. I am paying attention to something, but paying attention to all of the ways in which we're enmeshed in the world and the natural world and all of the ways in which it wants to actually have a relationship with us too. Once you start paying that kind of attention, stuff happens. I know so many people just
Well,
synchronous.
it's kind of like if one opens up a little, then synchronicity is the kind of brother or something that or sister that comes in with that opening up, and
Exactly.
uh, what what some people might call the meaningfulness increases, the meaningfulness of events, and it's a better way to live. It's a better way to
Absolutely.
live than the kind of rational enlightenment.
For sure, because it is always about relationship. And I think that no matter how solitary you might be, if you have this sense of the world around you is genuinely alive and ensouled, then in a sense, you're not alone. I know it's not the same as a relationship with another human being, but all of a sudden that sense of separation, that sense of isolation, I think has a tendency then to vanish. And it really is, that all of the things that we've just been talking about. I mean, to go back to Hillman, that sense of the daimon, or is it daemon? I actually don't know how to pronounce that.
Uh,
Um,
I say Damon, but I think
you say daemon.
have
That's what
their
I would
own
be
take
inclined to
on
do
it.
as well. Okay, well, we'll go with that. We'll be right for that. But that sense of the daemon always pushing us, always, it's as if the imaginal world always wants to present things to us, always wants to communicate things with us, always wants to guide us if you want to look at it in a kind of more purposeful way.
Yeah,
And just be open to that. All you have to do is be open to that.
yeah.
And then
Well, we've been trained for a long time, perhaps not to be open to that,
yeah,
haven't we?
for
I
sure.
mean, to be fair, but
Yeah, absolutely.
and some people might say, well, what do you want to do? Just go back to how Indigenous people live. That that's not possible. But I don't personally see it. I think it is going back to that kind of awareness, but it doesn't mean it's not a regressive back. It's going back to
I don't
something
think we
it
can go
was.
back.
No.
Exactly. I don't think we can go back. I mean, even if the world ended tomorrow and we were all living, back in the woods again, we have knowledge that you can't do away with. And that's not always a bad thing. All knowledge
Yeah,
is not a bad thing,
that's
but
right.
it's finding a way of blending
Yeah,
contemporary life with a different approach to it. Now, it does seem to me that we would be kinder to the planet if we recognized everything around us as alive and develop the kind of relationship that most indigenous peoples do when they go hunting.
yeah,
They've got to eat, but
yeah,
they thank the deer or whatever it is that they're taking, and they respect its part in the world. And all of our old mythology here is exactly the same. So the Cailleach, for example, the old woman of Gaelic and Gaelic mythology, refuses to allow a hunter to take pregnant deer in season and says, if you leave my pregnant deer alone, I'll give you a stag at the appropriate time. So that sense of living in balance and harmony,
Yeah.
I think, has been in our traditions as well as other indigenous traditions for a long time. And we can still do that,
Mm.
I think, whilst accepting that, for better or worse, the world has changed.
And what about stories, Sharon? Myths, stories. I get this sense, we need to work them. We need to work with them. We need to get in them more. We've become, what have we become? We've got the attention span of 2 seconds or something. We've been regulated by or we've been inundated with images from social media or something where we can handle looking at a meme, but it's kind of like the imagination, which again is another theme of what you're talking about a lot, a key theme. Uh, how do we work with the imagination? How do we work with the mythic themes? How do we do all that?
Well, I think, everybody has their own particular, um, everyone has their own particular way of doing that. And my way is stories, because stories have always spoken to me. Ever since I was a tiny, tiny child, I've saved myself, I think, a lot of times with stories, from
Yeah,
fairy stories when I was a kid to novels and other kinds of fiction when I grew up. And so as a psychologist, I spent a lot of time thinking about why this was. And particularly with fairy tales, I have more of an interest in fairy tales than I do myth at the moment. I started
yeah,
off very much as a kind of myth person, and that's because they're very much tales of the folk. So myths tend to be about gods and heroes and kind of superhumans, and it's kind of hard to live up to a myth sometimes. It's not that it doesn't clearly reflect some aspect of how the world is. That's the definition of a myth, that has some kind of explicatory power, that it tells us how the world is and what our place in it is. So that has its role. But fairy tales are the tales of the folk. They're a subset of folk tales. And even if there's a princess in it, that princess is still us. It's a normal princess. It's not a princess who's a magician or a witch. It's just a normal, everyday princess. So these stories, I think, and all of the things that happen to heroes and heroines in fairy tales have a different kind of ease. They sit easier with us, and I think we can clearly relate to them more. And I work a lot with story today, and particularly with fairy tales, and particularly on my Substack. And every time we do one of my kind of fairy tale salons where we take a fairy tale and then we kind of pick it apart, we try not to do the meaning thing, very, very much a Hillman-esque kind of approach to it, in the sense of letting the image in the story or
sure.
the character in the story reveal themselves to you. But nevertheless, people are just delving so very deeply into them and seeing things. I'm surprised constantly every time I do one of these things that people think of things in the stories that I don't know. And it's not just that it reflects their lives, but it gives them a very beautiful image to carry with them. So let's say you have a terrible midlife trauma and bad things happen, marriages fall apart, you get diagnosed with cancer or something, something has to shift. That old, mostly Scottish story of the Selkie, the seal woman who
Yeah,
loses her skin because a fisherman steals it from her.
yeah,
That's such a powerful story for women, but it's powerful not because it kind of is a metaphor for what's happened to them. It's this image of a skin. I've lost my skin, and this beautiful image of a seal pelt stays with them and lodges in them and continues to work on them without
yeah,
them trying to interpret it. And it kind of gives it's not a purpose. It just kind of illuminates the journey and says, okay, this is what this is about, isn't it? This is perfectly natural. I'm not unusual. The power in that is quite remarkable, as
mm,
well as the power of the characters. And so in my later book, Haggitude, my last book, what I was doing is I did a long, long research project, and it's coming to an end in my forthcoming book in October, Wise Women, to look at throughout European folklore and a little bit myth, looking for older women characters, looking for women in the second half of their lives. Because, everybody thinks, oh, they play bit parts. And when you say to someone, even a woman, who's an older woman in a fairy tale that you remember? It's always the Wicked Witch. But 5 years of looking into that has shown me that there are many, many interesting older women in European myth and fairy tale. Diverse ways of being older, diverse gifts from the kind of mentorship of the young that we see to the dangerous old woman like Baba Yaga in the woods, who is a very, very serious tester of the mettle of young
But
people.
she's also an initiator, isn't she?
Absolutely, that's what she does.
Mm.
And, there are consequences if you fail her test. Of course, you get baked in her, big man-sized oven. But there are women, old women, who weave the world into being. Think of the fates in Greek mythology. And so these stories not only give us images that are very beautiful and stay with us, but they also show us how it might be possible to be an older woman, for example, in the case of Hagitude, in a world which doesn't seem quite to know what to do with us.
Well,
So they're
it's
remarkable
kind of
sources.
like that youth, what is it? The youth culture, the youth adulation. It's coming to terms with the old woman or the wise old man for men, I suppose, whatever. But it's kind of like how to reacquaint ourselves with the rich and full aspects of those, because we live in a youth culture that will dispose of you once you're over 45.
Exactly. And so most of the women that I have spoken to about this over the years are just like, well, I'd like to be different, but I don't know where to begin. And there are so few contemporary role models
Mm.
who model different ways of being an older woman
Helen
because we're
Mirren, Helen Mirren does.
and Mirren is wonderful. But again, no, not all of us can be famous, beautiful actresses. So that's very wonderful.
Yeah,
But it's kind of like, okay, what does it mean for me? And again, if you go back to the old story, I always go back to the stories. When I haven't got
yeah.
a contemporary answer, you find it in the stories because our ancestors, although, they clearly there was no lost golden age, but nevertheless, our ancestors, I think, knew some things that we didn't.
Mm. Yeah,
And that's
embedded
reflected in the stories.
embedded in the stories somehow.
Absolutely.
But it is like learning how to speak another language, isn't it? It's kind of like to become acquainted with the language and perhaps some of the symbols. I'm not talking about getting a symbols book and a key means this or
Right.
something, but it is slowly uh, being able to get into the story.
Yeah, it is, but I think people get it very quickly. And I mostly work with women because I'm very passionate about women's stories being kind of um, reimagined and also brought back into the cultural conversation again after rather a few centuries of being suppressed. So I do tend to focus on women, but it really, women just have an inner knowing. They have an understanding of that. They just have an understanding of symbol and working with story and of archetypes and what have you. And it's just very easy. You just show them a little way, a little path, a couple of little tricks, and they're off. And it's quite a remarkable phenomenon. And that, I think, has convinced me of the power of fairy tales
Mm.
more than anything else. And, when I was practicing, so when I came back to Scotland from America after I got my pilot's license, I went back and to my psychology roots and learned some new tricks and practiced with a focus mostly on narrative, Okay, there
Mm.
you go. So using story and myth for transformation. And, cognitive behavioral therapy is a wonderful therapy. Very, very effective in lots of ways, but it's not very exciting. It's not going to capture anybody's imagination. People are desperate to stop doing it. It's very, very boring. A lot of people just won't do it because it's so boring. But a story, you've got them
Yeah,
instantly. You've
yeah,
captured the imagination. And the whole point of a fairy tale is to show how the hero or heroine gets out of what seems like an impossible situation, transforms themselves and often the world around them. There you go. So even if you don't have the clear solution to your problems in a story, because it's never that simplistic, you've got this belief beginning to
yeah,
embed itself in people that, oh God,
yeah,
yeah, all of the stories I've ever heard, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
this can happen.
Well, let's say in what was who was that guy Arnold von Gennep or Gennep? I'm not sure how you say it.
Again, yeah,
Separation, initiation, return. You've got that
always.
somehow the structure, haven't you? That there's always the possibility of redemption, of return, of
Exactly, exactly. And there's a French philosopher called René Guénon who he wrote about a lot of things, but he had a very strong belief that back in the day, wisdom was encoded in fairy tales
yeah,
as the world was changing, so that it wouldn't be lost, and that one day or in some time, people would come along who would kind of like unpick and pick that wisdom again. And I think there is a lot of that in the world. I mean, look at the, fairy, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but fairy tales are all over the place here.
Mm.
In a way that they never have been before. I mean, not necessarily the ways in which I work with them, but just a kind of fascination with fairy tales, retellings of fairy tales. It's kind of
But
an
but
interesting.
sometimes people maybe get a bit stuck in the heroic. I'm thinking of
Oh, definitely. Yeah,
Disney now or whatever.
yeah.
That there's the superhero, which is still a bit. I think Hillman said, like America and the heroic model. The two they go
Sure. Well, of
hand
course,
in hand.
Joseph Campbell. Yeah, Joseph Campbell. I mean, for clarity, I have a lot of admiration for Joseph Campbell. He was an amazing scholar and did some
Yeah,
remarkable work, but he was very much a man of his time. He was writing The Hero with a Thousand Faces, in which he kind of defined the hero's journey for the first time. I mean, that was published in 1949, and it was a very heroic time in Western history, but certainly in American history. But look at what the myth of the hero has done for us, the kind of individualism, the kind of swashbuckling, the I'm gonna slay the dragon and save the world. That didn't go well. To me, the time of the hero is definitely over. And so
yeah.
I talk a lot about the post-heroic journey. I wrote a little bit about that in The Enchanted Life, and I've kind of developed that a bit since.
But I think I mean, I'm not really qualified to get into this with you, but I think it's perhaps not Joseph Campbell's fault that people
No,
literalize at Disney,
of course.
because he
Yeah.
he actually wrote a tremendous amount about the feminine, the Odyssey, the uh,
Well,
well,
eventually he
he might
did,
have been a bit
but
old
don't.
school.
He was more than old school. I mean, don't forget that when Maureen Murdoch, who was a student of Campbell's at Pacifica, I think, asked Campbell, you're talking about a lot of men here. Where's the female hero? And he actually said to Murdoch, the woman doesn't need to make the journey. She's the place that the hero is trying to get to. I mean, come on. Now, Campbell got a lot of stick for that, and over the course of his life, he moderated that a bit. But that was his going in point. Murdoch then wrote her own kind of conceptualization of the heroine's journey, and we've all been working on it ever since. But I think this sense that it's a very masculine kind of external, linear, swashbuckling thing is the problem, is a genuine problem with the hero's journey. And I think if we go back to our old stories, say in my British and Irish traditions, we find a lot of them are not heroic at all. Campbell was very selective. He was a comparative mythologist. He didn't know any mythology very, very deeply. That wasn't his job. That's not a criticism, it's a statement. But a lot of the things that he considered to be heroic really aren't. If you go back and you know the mythology, the Grail quest is a classic thing. That's not a heroic journey of Parsifal who attains the Grail. Because what Parsifal does to attain the Grail has got nothing to do with all of the battles he wins, nothing to do with the fine knight that he is. He attains the Grail by asking, finally, of the wounded Fisher King, what ails thee? That's not a heroic thing. Do you know? And so all of these old stories tell us about living in balance and harmony with the natural world. They tell us about community rather than individuality. And I do think that the time of the hero has had its day, and it's time to
Yeah,
go back a little bit, just unpick some of those threads,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
Sorry, you've got me off on a
Yeah,
on
no,
an anti-heroic rant. I
but I
apologize.
think he was trying. To me, he was trying to get there, and um, he kind of appreciated the feminine in that, but he was perhaps he was a little bit from another time. But other people literalize him a lot more than he like. The search for the Grail, the search for the cup. That's not heroic. That's perhaps the initiation through feminine
Yeah, yeah, but
mystery
okay.
and all of
So
that.
is the woman initiated through the feminine? I mean, we could have a long conversation about this, and probably not the place to do it. But as I came in saying that I really do appreciate Campbell, and
Yeah,
I do, but I think that at that point it became time for women to tell our own stories. Okay, so Murdoch did the heroine's journey. That wasn't going to be Campbell ever, in fairness to Campbell.
yeah,
But it's time for us to tell our own stories, and that's again what I tried to do in If Women Rise Rooted, where I was talking about what I kind of called at that time the eco heroine's journey, which is this journey that women have to make back to a place of belonging, a
yeah.
relationship, and responsibility for the land, just like the women in our older stories were doing too. So there are lots of ways to approach the journey
There
through
are.
life, aren't there? I don't think
Yeah.
there's any one.
The
Mhm.
soul is another way, because the
Mm.
soul's kind of has commonalities of threads. Um, but the other thing I wanted to ask you is the wild. You know, uh, it seems to me it's something that's often misunderstood. I'm thinking of Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the wild woman. Or perhaps other people, might talk about the wild man or whatever. But it's like, what does it really mean to be wild? My sense is it's natural. It's the natural person. It's the soul that's connected in the world, alive, and all of that.
Sure. I mean, there's a long, long tradition in Scottish, particularly, and other European folklore of the wild man, starting from the original Merlin, who was originally Mervyn, or a guy called Lycolin in the Scottish borders, who was the kind of archetypical wild man of the woods, who was very deeply connected and had his knowledge and his wisdom and his prophetic knowledge from his relationship with with the non-human world. And we see that also in a number of stories, fewer, but stories of women. So If Women Are Rooted, I talk about a wonderful old Irish story of a character called Mish, who, to cut a long story short, is on a battlefield looking for her father, dead bodies everywhere, finds her father beheaded and limbs strewn around, and is just so overcome with grief and horror at the brutality of this that she grows feathers and wings and fur and flies off into the mountains, where she becomes a wild woman and eventually comes back to herself, actually with the help of a really nice man. But that sense of the wild, I think, is also very instinctual. And Clarissa wrote about this very beautifully in Women Who Run with the Wolves. I think for women, it's that kind of instinctual knowledge, that embodied knowledge, all of the feminine qualities that we're told aren't useful to the world anymore, intuition and creativity.
Yeah.
And I think for men, it's maybe slightly different. It's the same, absolutely um, the same general perspective, but maybe it's slightly different. But that's what it is to me. It's about that knowing. And again, it comes back to embodiment. It's what our bodies know.
And instinctual life as well. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
one thing I get from Hillman is his fascination with the animal and the animals.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he
Animal Presence is a brilliant book. Yeah.
animal presences, and he collected the animal dreams from the first time, and what does he call it? There's aesthetics, and then there's the direct sense perception. The when back in ancient times, when the heart, we thought more through the heart and through our direct sense and our sense of at what we saw or whatever, and that's like the animal, and
Yeah.
people tend to think about the animal maybe wild, the wild animal, but it's the natural part of us or something like that.
I think also he seems to be making the point that you can best know kind of animal imagery, if you like, through actually being with animals. And again, that seems to me really, really important to know the animals in your place. I mean, I have a desperately strong relationship with crows, with corvids of all kind, actually. We have a bunch of thuggish jackdaws out here that kind of break the place up and are very, very funny. But knowing, understanding the imaginal, not just from hearing about them in stories or
Mm,
seeing what they are, what they're doing in your dreams, but actually just looking at the animal and learning to look at the animal with what he called a mythic sensibility,
mm,
which is so, and I talk about this all the time when I'm trying to explain what I mean by the mythic imagination, which is, okay, there's a crow. It's a black bird. It has these behaviors. It eats this. It lives in this kind of environment. That's really important and very, very wonderful, because a crow is wonderful. Crow is an amazing bird. But when I look at a crow, I see all of that because I know my birds. But I also see the Morrigan, the Irish goddess of life, of death and rebirth. I see all of the trickster crow stories that I know. And I think what that does, again, it deepens relationship, but it begins with the embodied knowledge of that bird outside my window or that bird in my garden, and that's so
mm.
important. And I think it seemed to me anyway, I don't think I'm just projecting my own predilections on it, that Hillman did a wonderful job in Animal Presences of talking about that as well. So he was talking about animals and dreams, but he was also talking about real life animals.
Well, that's good. So what happens next? Sharon, what's the next? Now that the writing is flowing out of you, and you're across on Substack, where with many subscribers on Substack. So what's the next plan? And what
I
is the
don't know.
daemon? What is the daemon saying?
That's really interesting. I don't know. I've always questioned that, because I've been doing this work in one way or another now for, oh, I don't know. I'm going to say 15 years rather than 20. Probably 15 years full time solidly doing this. And I'm always looking at where I do try to be quiet, rather than saying as I used to do kind of in my youth, okay, I have this ambition, I'm going to do that. It's just like, no, okay, what's really kind of rising up in me?
Yeah,
Um, and I don't always know until it kind of happens. But I've always had this interesting kind of I've had two archetypal images in myself all through my life, I think. So there's this one part of me that knows I have something to offer the world. I have to be in the world. I
yeah,
have to be writing. I have to be teaching.
yeah,
There's another part of me that finds that very, very difficult and just wants to be the old woman in the woods. People can come and find her if they need her, but just she's not out there. And I long
yeah,
for the old woman in the woods, but it's not
yeah,
quite my time. So I think maybe I'm just moving towards that. Substack is a very beautiful platform because it allows you don't have to write a book there, so all of the ideas that I have about the mythic imagination that don't fit
yeah,
into a book, then you can just kind of drip
yeah.
them out
That's
out
good.
there.
I like how you're saying there's those two different things. There's something about, I don't know, I think this thing of contributing or being of service, it makes things grow in oneself, you know. But
Exactly.
then there's that other, what is it, competing, like there's different energies, isn't there? And there's like
Definitely.
that other one is it's kind of like the the person that can just enjoy. Um,
I think I've always thought that there are two elements to calling. There may be more, but anyway, these are the two that are relevant to me. And there's one, and that whole soul's journey. I mean, going again back to Plato, we choose to be in this world. And on the one hand, there's service to the world. We are here, I think, as souls to be in service to the world. But I
yeah.
think we're also here for our own soul growth.
Mm.
And in theory, the two, I think calling is kind of you're living your calling when somehow those two things come into you're doing those two things at the same time. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of us, I have far too much energy on service to the world, and I've broken at least once in my life because of that. And that's part of the soul journey, I think, to learn that. But when those two things are in balance, I think that's probably the art of perfection, and that's kind of what I see the teaching and the kind of old woman in the woods. If somehow they can come into balance, then I'll have ticked that box maybe if I can put
Yeah.
it in a
Yeah.
silly
No,
way.
that's lovely. I remember something that Robert Bly said, that the soul has come here to experience its own joy. And
Yeah.
it reminds me of a very Rumi-esque kind of, that we're here for our own joy. And then, uh, but there's this
Yeah,
other,
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've kind of been in a room with like 20-year-olds and they're desperate. They haven't found their calling yet, as if it's a kind of destination. But there is also a sense that I haven't got a calling because, I'm just an ordinary woman. I'm just an ordinary mother, or something like that. And it's just like, that's not what it is about. To me, calling is about expressing your own unique way of being human in
yeah,
this world,
very
you
much,
know?
very much.
That's it. I mean, you could do that by being Greta Thunberg and trying to save the world, or you can do that by growing a beautiful garden that gives pleasure to everybody as it walks by. It's not a big thing in that sense. It's just expressing who you are. And I think if we can do that authentically, which is where a lot of the Jungian work comes in, that sense of developing your own authenticity, particularly in the second half of life, then again, we're
I,
almost there.
I think, no one can have exactly the same point of view. And perhaps it seems to me we're in this political thing, between two forces. And there is a bit of a culture war and all that. But where I see Hillman with his daemon and calling and what you're talking about as well is that if someone can just be honest and truthful about their own view on the world, because everyone was kind of sent here to give something. And if that's your view, um, if you can express that honestly, then there we go.
Absolutely, but I do think that, and I recognize I might be a little bit extreme on the heroic, but I do think that that's also a function of a very heroic perspective on the world where somebody has to win, and so we see these differing views not as, an expression of a beautiful garden of humanity, if I can be a little bit cliched about it, with the roses and the tulips and all of the other things, not competing with each other, but just being there in the garden. We don't see it in that kind of soul. We don't see it with the eyes of soul. We see it as a kind of competitive thing. And we see it in that kind of, yeah, I do think of it as heroic, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, it can just
That's
be an expression. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and sharing and all of that. And
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
thanks. See you later.
Okay.